Good afternoon and welcome to the Division 47 webinar. All participants are muted throughout the webinar. Please submit any questions using the Questions tab. Questions will be answered within the last 15 minutes of the presentation. And now we will have an introduction of the speakers by Ryan Sappington.
Welcome everyone. Today's webinar is entitled Athletes and Sexual Assault, Current and Future Practice in Prevention, Psychological Intervention, and Organizational Response. This presentation is hosted by APA Division 47, the Society for Sport, Exercise, and Performance Psychology. My name is Ryan Sappington, and I'm one of two student representatives for Division 47, along with Julie Wieselmeyer. And on behalf of the division, we'd like to welcome you all to today's event. We're going to have three presenters today, and we'll leave approximately 15 minutes at the end for a question and answer session. As questions come up during the presentation, feel free to send them in using your webinar control panel. The webinar will be recorded and posted on the Division 47 social media pages and listserv in the coming weeks. Finally, Division 47 will be live tweeting during the webinar. If you are on social media during or after the event, please use #sportsandviolence. We're fortunate to have an amazing panel of speakers and moderator agree to take part in today's event. The presenters today include Connie Kirkland, John Heil, and Mitch Abrams. Connie Kirkland is the director of Nova Care's office and manages the Sexual Assault Services Program at Northern Virginia Community College. She's a contributing author of the 2016 NCAA Sexual Violence Prevention Toolkit. Connie will be talking about the NCAA's role in responding to sexual assault. Dr. John Heil is a licensed clinical psychologist and ASP certified consultant based in Roanoke, Virginia, a former president of Division 47, and has served as a board member for Roanoke Sexual Assault Response Awareness. John will be discussing organizational response to sexual assault and interpersonal violence. Dr. Mitch Abrams is a sports psychologist licensed in New York and New Jersey and a national expert on anger and violence in sports. He is one of the few sports psychologists who also works in forensics, as he has overseen mental health services in New Jersey's prison system for the past 17 years. Mitch will be discussing sexual assault in athlete populations, focusing on the state of the field and future directions. Finally, our moderator for today's webinar is Dr. Judy Van Ralt. Judy is a professor of psychology at Springfield College, an ASP certified consultant, and a former president of the division. Judy will summarize and facilitate the Q&A segment at the conclusion of the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Connie Kirkland.
Welcome. Glad you're here with us today. Might as well go to the next slide. Okay, and the next one. All right, so we thought we'd start today with some background information about when and how the whole issue of campus sexual assault came to the forefront. And you'll see a list of federal laws here that have really changed the landscape for us, and relatively recently. 1990, when the Jean Clary Act was passed, and you can see that it's been amended several times. It started down the road of keeping track of and presenting programming on campus related to several issues, one of which was sexual assault. After that, 1994, the Violence Against Women Act came along, and you can see again that it's been amended several times, but it does show, and it has shown, increase in both services and funding for organizations who are interested in sexual assault, both on the campus and in the community. Probably our most important piece of legislation that really was passed in 1972, but again in 2011, the Dear Colleague letter came out to all institutions with a very new and raised emphasis on sexual assault in Title IX, which caused most campuses and universities and colleges to really rethink what they have been doing with regard to sexual assault and how they respond to it. Then in 2013, the Campus Save Act was passed first as a standalone act, but then it was amended into Clary via the VAWA, and what it did primarily was increase services and ensure rights to both sides involved in a sexual assault case on campus, as well as including statistical gathering for stalking, dating violence, and domestic violence. Just a year later, the White House had a sexual assault task force, which created a very well-rounded report that went out to all the schools and helped all colleges and universities really address the issue more forthrightly than we had. So now we're in 2017, and what might be next? We're not exactly sure, but we know that these laws have made us think more about the topic. Next slide. So why is this so important to us? Well, we're probably aware of the prevalence. I mean, we hear about it almost daily on the news these days, and there have been so many research studies that have shown the same percentages that you see on the screen. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 16 or 17 men on a college campus will be victimized in some way by sexual assault. Then with that, we have such a small percentage that are reporting these issues, these crimes, to the police. And so what that really means is there are many students who are left without a response because they have not reported it officially. Part of the reason for that is the statistic also that says 80% or more of these cases know each other. The victim knows the attacker. And it makes it more difficult for students, especially students, but any victim who knows her or his attacker, to make a police report. And so thus rape and other sexual assaults remain very underreported, and it's no surprise that rape victims have the highest PTSD rate, even though sometimes we think that belongs to combat veterans. Next slide. Yep, sexual assault's unique. It's different. It's a very different issue with far-reaching effects on not only the survivor, but his or her family and significant others, and I think the culture that surrounds us, both in our institution as well as society as a whole. Blaming victims is a real barrier to reporting, and sometimes we blame without even recognizing that that's what we're doing. Trauma and fragmented memories inhibit effective response at times, and certainly judgmental questions increase trauma and decrease interest in reporting or getting services if that's needed. Next slide. So there has been a White House call to action in 2014, and in that call to action are these pieces of information that you see there. Mostly these are the general effects of a sexual assault on a victim survivor. And what trauma does to a victim increases the risk for both health and psychological well-being. And the cited effects that are listed here are certainly very common, and they range from physical to severe psychological issues that have caused many issues later on in life: eating disorders, cutting, and certainly the last one, which of course is the worst and of course the most dangerous, with devastating effects. And to consider attempt or commit suicide is something that we certainly want to prevent if at all possible. Next slide. What trauma also does is really make decision-making vulnerability. And what I mean by that is it's just not easy to think clearly, and part of that's because the brain doesn't process the same as it had before after a sexual assault and the resulting trauma. And so you can only imagine how difficult it is to continue regular, normal life, whether that is at school, at a job, or socially. So there are a great many areas of loss that result: social, physical, financial, academic, legal. And if we go on to the student athlete now, it adds, all those things of course are there, but we've added 3 more characteristics that need to be considered for a student athlete: the training, the travel, and the performance. These are aspects of an athlete's life that can very greatly be impacted by a sexual assault. and inhibit, or maybe I should say affect, the performance level. And so athletic departments are beginning to struggle with that and to try to figure out a better way to work with athletes who have been exposed to sexual assault. Next slide. So I have to say that, because of all these concerns that are, have been generated across the country, the NCAA has responded rather quickly. There was a summit that was held by the leadership of NCAA, and following that was an NCAA think tank was convened here in Washington, D.C., where they brought 18 experts together to share needs and perspectives about the topic of sexual assault. And those experts were from legal areas, advocates, researchers, educators, and others who had profound interest in the topic. What came out of that was a year later in 2013, these same think tank members worked with the NCAA Sports Science Institute to begin research to figure out how better the NCAA could respond, could help their member institutions both prevent and respond to this issue. In 2014, the NCAA Executive Committee, which is the highest point of leadership in the NCAA at that point, wrote a statement on sexual violence prevention and complaint resolution, and it was approved unanimously. And so that was the greatest beginning, I think, for this group. Next slide. In that same year, 2014, the NCAA published its first guide addressing sexual assault and interpersonal violence, athletics' role in support of healthy and safe campuses. This has 50 pages and it's packed with information for the membership. I'm proud to be a contributing author to this document, which was distributed to all the members, presidents of member institutions, as well as the athletic departments, directors. And it was developed basically as a proactive educational response to the crime of sexual assault. Next. So within the guide, we do have the executive committee statement at the beginning for everyone to not only read, but to recognize that this is coming from the top. This is the leadership saying that the NCAA and its members need to really address sexual assault in a different way than it has been before. The guide is mostly philosophical and legal in its nature, but there are 5 different categories that are covered pretty carefully and succinctly with great information. And we started out with the nature and prevalence of the issues because everyone is not on the same page, and we wanted to bring everybody up to at least the starting point to understand about the issue. Compliance is listed, and both Title IX and CLARI legal requirements are discussed in the guide, again bringing everybody to the same page. Student-athlete perspective, their roles and perceptions are noted and discussed about how they can get engaged in the process. Collaboration was a big thing that we wanted to include, and collaboration has been in just about everything that the NCAA has done since we've been working together on this topic, because working with the entire campus is the ideal, so that athletic departments do not have to do all of this by themselves. We don't want them to do all of this by themselves. We want them to be a part of the entire college or university campus in the 3 aspects: prevention, response, and recovery. And then the last portion of the guide is educational programming in athletics with different topics and different suggestions and different resources that any athletic department can use. Okay, next. So just 2 quotes I thought were important from the guide that I'd like to read. The effects of sexual assault and interpersonal violence cause real and often lasting emotional, cognitive, physical, and other types of damage to its victims. Statement of fact. Next, athletics has a unique platform on most campuses from which it can visibly and vocally support its colleagues across campus who are working to make the campus safer for all students. Again, a very collaborative sentence and document. Thank you. Next. All right, the next step taken by the NCAA was to create a sexual assault task force convened with 8 selected members composed primarily from think tank members. And then we as a task force have met often, have presented at national conferences and conventions, and have worked together to write the next document that was published by the NCAA, the toolkit, to create really practical application, practical steps to ensure athletic department engagement across the country. Next. So it was published in 2016. We're getting close to now. And it is a toolkit that we believe builds on the critical elements that were outlined in the first guide. There was great collaboration with other organizations putting this guide together, and you'll notice at the bottom where it says that it has actually been endorsed by 12 higher education organizations and 6 NCAA committees, so that it's a guide that is believed to be representative of the state of the art and hopefully helpful to individual institutions and their athletic departments. Okay. What the guide does, or what this toolkit does, is follows the original areas of commitment on the NCAA, and you'll see them listed there, the same ones that I mentioned before. But this time, each one has a checklist of things that an institution can do to better itself in each of those 5 areas, as well as tools for individual institutions to use to ensure a safer culture. And the other part of that is there are resources at the end of the toolkit for each of those 5 areas, which are very practical tools that any institution can use. I think the important part of the toolkit, and there we have it, 3 words in red, is that NCAA member schools really have a responsibility to address the issue of sexual violence appropriately and effectively. Okay, next. The most current step that's been taken is the NCAA Board of Governors Commission to Combat Campus Sexual Violence, which was very recently created. And Board of Governors is now the title of what was known as the Executive Committee. So it is the highest level of leadership for the NCAA. And this membership of 24 people is a combination of educational and athletics leaders from both small and large institutions. And what the commission is doing is working hard to define the roles of the different aspects of NCAA, you know, within the institution, within conferences, within the association itself, and to hold accountable all aspects of athletics. Okay, next. So, you know, we are moving forward. You know, it's just been a very few years, but so much has been done, and so many steps have been taken by the NCAA to prevent and respond to the issue of sexual assault. It is definitely a top-down commitment, and just like any other issue that we know of, nothing changes, nothing happens overnight. It takes a while, but I believe that the NCAA is on the right path. Next. And that's it for me. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Connie. Let me continue. I think your presentation points out a good example of organizational response, being accountable, trying to get ahead of the problem, and trying to do the right thing. So I'd like to expand on the whole concept of organizational response and note that although we're focused today on sexual assault, the same kind of tactics and dynamics of organizational response are seen in a variety of situations, including all forms of interpersonal violence, hazing, bullying, and so forth. And in this regard, the organizational response is like it's like a wild card. Can do as the NCAA is trying to do and prepare its member institutions to be accountable and therefore be prepared to seek a remedy. But we know that there's many institutions that are at a minimum enabling and sometimes engage in a set of practices that rise to the level of institutional betrayal. And that's something I'd like to elaborate upon today. Next slide. So as mentioned, when things happen as they should, and there's an opportunity for psychologists to intervene, the solution is on its way. Recently, I consulted with a local college where there was an unfortunate hazing incident with one of the women's teams, and the demeanor and the attitude of the school was like, you know, we have this problem, here's what we've started to do, we want some expert guidance, we want to protect the well-being of those who are offended, and we want to get the message out in terms of what we see as proper conduct to the team and to the athletic department as a whole, and by extension to the student body. And they make reference to the importance of their mission as an educational institution in training people, helping them develop, helping them address shortcomings, mistakes, and errors, learn from them, and be better prepared after the fact by the time they leave the school to be advocates and to respond appropriately to situations. Next slide. On the flip side is the well-publicized Baylor situation where there was essentially apparently a rape culture that was systematic, pervasive, extensive, extended, and by all appearances seems to have had support all the way up through the chain of command to the top. And fortunately, this one was exposed, and there were consequences for this, but so many times the organizations are able to escape accountability just because of the power dynamic that they have, and the circling the wagons mentality, where there's this tightness of uniform response and kind of keeping everyone else out. So next slide. Okay, so look at the tactics. There's a common set of tactics that are employed, and they include delay, deny, misdirect, deconstruct, and double bind. Next slide, please. Delay is a very common legal tactic. Essentially holds accountability off, and it tends to drive attrition. Sometimes people move on. Sometimes they wear out just from the psychological fatigue of the struggle of carrying the cause and the issue forward. And as this goes on, the psychological costs tend to mount as the individual is unable to gain closure, and as these situations remain at the forefront of their consciousness, so they tend to be re-traumatized. The situation gets worse, wearing them down, and again, contributing to attrition. Next slide. Let's talk about denial. I think not just psychologists, but others understand that there's a form of denial that's rather benign. It's just a psychological defense mechanism. It's unintentional. It's a way of protecting someone from being overwhelmed emotionally. In healthy practices, eventually denial is resolved. People deal with the issue and then can resolve it as best they can and move forward. But then there's a slide down a slippery slope, and I would say the next level down is the whole idea of, I'd say, moral disbelief. And I think as I would take a look at the Penn State situation that we saw, where there's so many people involved, including very reputable people, people well known to be people of integrity, behaving in a way that seemed out of character. And not to defend it, but sometimes I think in situations like this, people simply have a hard time processing the truth of what's happening, the truth of what's in front of them. I think the work by the NCAA, the educational things, help counter that and make that less likely to happen. And so I would see that as one benefit of the efforts there. And then there's lying. You know, people just lie. They stonewall. They don't tell the truth. And some people are very good at this. They have a lot of practice at it. And so that's the end point of denial. Next slide. Now we'll look at misdirection, and I'd like to reference the work of Ken Pope on the whole concept of ethics placebos. These are the things people do to kind of rewrite the story and skip out from under. And he does this great thing where he gives very specific examples and he names these. And so we can refer to them and describe them. And he talks about 8 tricks of language, 22 cognitive strategies, justification, and the same number of logical fallacies. And one he talks about, just to give you one example of a tactic, is the appeal to ignorance. This refers to the scenario where an organization will investigate itself and find itself innocent when simply the whole purpose of the investigation is to, it's a sham, it's just essentially a cover-up. But so that's an example of something that he's named. The whole process of misdirection includes the placebos, but it also includes a deconstructing of the story. So I think as psychologists we understand it, historians understand it, many people understand that things have meaning and context. We want all the details, we want the full story, and that helps us interpret what's happening and really see what the underlying meaning is. And one of the key steps in the misdirection and the use of ethics placebos is to try to take the story, break it into pieces, and focus on those for which there may be some alternate explanation. Okay, next slide. And then lastly, there's the double bind that naturally evolves in many of these situations where when the organization refuses to acknowledge the situation and maintains control, there is no option. So essentially they are double bound, which creates an illusion of choice. Do one thing, lose, do the other thing, lose. And this is the prototypical dynamic in sexual assault in general, where often the victim ends up feeling punished. In the sports situation, in the college situation, for instance, the person's choice is to leave the organization or to accept institutional betrayal as a condition of continuing membership in the organization, which is really no choice at all. In the case where there's someone that's on a team, the challenge to them is a double challenge, both as a victim and a whistleblower. So essentially, as a victim, they're suffering shame regarding disclosure. As a whistleblower, they're suffering jeopardy regarding team status, so they're caught. Those are the kind of double bind traps. Next slide. A quote from R.D. Laing from his book Knots, which looks at this type of thing in life. Classic work back from the 70s, late 60s. And he says they're playing a game. They're playing a game at not playing a game. If I show them, I see they are, I shall break the rules, and they will punish me. I must play their game of not seeing, I see their game. And this is the dynamic of enforced silence, where people do speak up. They stand to suffer. So next slide, please. So this problem is common enough and worrisome enough that it needs a name, and let's just call it the Helms effect. I think when these types of things happen in an institution, an esteemed institution like our colleges and universities, they're all the worse for it because it's a clear deviation from the mission. Colleges aren't in the business of making money, they're in the business of developing people. And when they drift from this mission, people suffer even more because of the high-minded expectations. And in fact, sometimes the esteemed institutions will leverage their status as a way of making it even harder for victims to speak out. And this reflects itself the skewed power dynamic that's at the root of a lot of the situations where a remedy is not immediately forthcoming. So I can talk briefly in a college president's office, laying out a very detailed accounting of events, some flagrant, worrisome, and then a lot of other details to fill in context. And even as we're speaking, right in front of me, the process of deconstruction began. Little pieces pull apart and reinterpreted, and then eventually and finally in the appeal to ignorance placebo, college investigates itself, finds itself innocent, and essentially says so and puts is even in capital letters. And I think that talks to the comfort that some have within the protective mechanism of the power of the university and the power of the organization, which creates very formidable opinion. So the Helms effect is essentially, metaphorically speaking, the ship adrift. It refers to the Greek myth of Dionysius, and essentially it's a failed moral compass when the ship of the university goes off course from its mission. Okay, next slide. What I'd like to do is take a couple minutes to elaborate on a case study, but first I want to lay out what I call the advocacy value proposition. So when situations like this are very difficult to step forward and very difficult to act upon, and before you go forward, you should ask yourself, what are the benefits and costs? To me, more importantly, of course, to the person that's being advocated for, and then to others who may get caught up in this. We need to understand that effects can be short-term, they can be long-term, they can affect individuals, they can affect the team, and sometimes certain situations will affect society at large. The letter from victim Emily Doe, this has a tremendous worldwide impact, really. And then there's the unintended consequences. Okay, next slide. So I had an official role as a consulting psychologist in an organization. There was an official in that organization who raised concern, who was had an official role and had a wide sphere of influence in the organization, who was known also to engage in what I'll just refer to as extracurricular activities with individuals of the same gender, which was outside his role and inadvertently enabled by the organization. So there were multiple reports of concern that arose to the level of leadership of the organization, but no victim, no one to come forward, although there were absent former players raising question. So there's the question of a crime or a misdeed and stepping forward. If we step forward now, perhaps we can prevent something from happening, but if we step forward now and there's no victim, no one to give a face to the problem, it becomes more defensible. So we're faced with essentially an ethical dilemma. Do we wait for the crime, or do we just go ahead and act? Next slide. The executive director essentially did decide to act, gave me information from multiple sources. What I did was to take that information then and present it to both a police sex crime specialist and to a psychological profiler, and both said that the individual showed most of the signs and signals of being a sexual predator. Based on what I could tell them, they suggested the person was most likely very much the low end of the scale, but certainly did appear to be on that scale. Looking at the advocacy proposition, the risk for acting regarding the question of a crime, could there be backlash against me in this case, anyone else that had chosen to step forward? Another risk, of course, is that not all people accused are guilty. We could think of the Duke sexual assault scandal as an example of that. Flip side, though, is there's risks also for not acting. There's the moral dilemma of letting it happen to one more person before we take action, and then the legal accountability of the organization for having had the opportunity to prevent things and not doing so. And then there was an unintended consequence effect, depending upon at the particular time this was done, the age of the persons that may have been involved, state statutes and prosecution strategy, where anti-gay laws could have been used to charge both the perpetrator and who we would call the victim with a sex crime. So the organization decided to act, step forward, did so quietly, tactfully, and remove the person from the position where they were able to take this action further. So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, John. Where I'm going to start, and I think I'm going to be a little bit more provocative than the previous two speakers, is that I think that the sports culture is going to eventually lead us to being proactive rather than reactive to what we've been doing with domestic dating and sexual violence in the sports world. And I disagree with John. I think that it would be nice if colleges were about developing people. But unfortunately, colleges are businesses. And it's going to be the financial pressures that lead to change. As Title IX settlements grow into the millions, the smaller schools are going to be bankrupted. And so either schools are going to address this problem, or financially they're not going to be able to continue to exist. Next slide, please. I think that if we want to understand this, we also should be thinking about who should be at the table and why. What was interesting to me in Connie's presentation is that there were a lot of experts that were brought to the table, but not a single sports psychologist was involved with the NCAA's task force on violence, and certainly not anybody that has experience with violence. This creates a dilemma, I think, for the division, because sports psychology doesn't generally train people to be experts in violence or trauma. And what we're talking about, if we're going to try to address this problem, is really at the interface of sports psychology and forensic psychology. That's the sweet spot. And there are a lot of people in the country that have that experience, but if we really want to get to where the issue is, we need to be able to pull from forensic psychology and integrate it into what we understand about athletics. Specifically, we need to understand more about perpetrators. Not just taking the victim's approach. It's important to understand what's going on with the victims and provide better treatment for them, without a doubt. But if you want to prevent victims, you have to understand what makes the perpetrators tick so that you can prevent them from recidivating. Next slide, please. Probably the most common model that's used in the forensic psychology world is the risk-need responsivity model, which is at the heart of nearly every approach to criminogenic behavior. What it states is that if you want to change a behavior, you have to understand what the risk factors are that contribute to it. Specifically, we would be talking about the risk factors that relate to the likelihood of becoming a sexual offender. Each of those risks also maps onto needs. You know, what are the needs of this individual to prevent them from reoffending, and how responsive will they be? So if we're going to provide an opportunity to put a dent in this process, we need to be able to assess their risk and provide treatment that addresses those issues in a way that can prevent further victimization. And Don Andrews, James Bonta, and Paul Gondreau were the pretty much the primary authors on the risk-need responsivity model. Next slide, please. This is what a comprehensive plan should look like. And it's very different from what we have out there right now. We need to have prevention that works. I'm going to talk about my assessment of what's gone on with prevention and why I think that it's been inadequate. But without the opportunities for risk assessment and treatment, all you're going to do is lead to the perpetrators moving to another place. It's a particular quandary for athletic departments, because if they have an athlete that's very gifted and talented, when they hear that something goes wrong, their first reaction is to cut them. But then they have to worry about them going to a competitor and then playing against them. So we need to have a model in place that focuses on all three aspects of these plans. And ultimately, the coaches and the parents have to be on board, but this is the leagues, schools, clubs, governing bodies. These are the people that have to really implement this type of approach. Next slide. It's worth noting that dating violence, domestic violence, and sexual violence are similar but not the same. The reason why I put these bidirectional arrows here is that it's important to understand that the risk-need responsivity model is exactly what we use to address dating, domestic, and sexual violence prevention and treatment. And the currency in all of those acts of violence is really about power. The last thing I want to say about that before moving on is that if you know anything about perpetrators, you understand that they're not a homogeneous group. So if you want to do something for prevention or treatment, you need to tailor it to what their particular needs are. A one-size-fits-all approach will not work. Next slide. Probably the most interesting or troubling thing for me is that the primary modality that's been used in intervention for sexual assault prevention is bystander intervention models. And if people know this or not, it really originated from the Kitty Genovese case, which is where they first started studying the bystander effect. Now, over time, we've come to realize that the story of what happened to Kitty Genovese was a little bit embellished by the police. But as the story was told initially, this is a woman in Kew Gardens, Queens, who was raped and murdered, and her perpetrator came back 3 separate times. Lights came on in a building, nobody called the police, And what we found, what the bystander effect says, is that the more you have more people involved with anonymity, there's a diffusion of responsibility. Now, the beautiful irony of the case is that the murderer eventually got caught because the police were called. But that was after this violent individual had the opportunity to come back 3 times. So for the bystander intervention model to be at the core of what we're doing is troubling to me, because bystander interventions haven't really shown to be effective, even though people have been propagating them for nearly 40 years. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, the interventions came from the bystander effect. And what do we know? Because very often when people try to identify prevention programs, especially for those that believe that athletes are more violent than non-athletes, it turns out that there's research that shows that it's not about being an athlete that might contribute to you being more likely to be violent, but there are particular characteristics. And what we see is in groups that have higher incidence of these behaviors, athletes and fraternities, they show similarities. There's a stratification of power. You have to understand, people of lower status are not going to stand up to higher status individuals. When I talk about a couple of cases in a moment, you'll realize that it just doesn't play out that way. Now, if you can get somebody to stand up, if one person stands up, 2 people are more likely to stand up. So it's not that bystander interventions don't work. They're necessary, but not sufficient. We need to understand that the groupthink that exists in groups, especially team dynamics, can lead people to go along with what the group is thinking. It doesn't mean that they are going to act off their own moral culture, their own moral compass. But if bystander interventions are going to work, it's going to require a real culture change. It requires the coaches, your administrators, your leaders, everybody on board has to be willing to change the culture. It's a worthy goal. It's worth doing, but very difficult, in my opinion, has been used too much as a standalone intervention for a long time. Next slide. This slide, the thing that you really want to look at is the red line. This is the Office for Civil Rights and recording of complaints that universities received with regards to sexual assaults. From 1980 to 2017, the numbers have steadily gone up. There has been no evidence that over time the interventions and the prevention models that have been put in place has led to any decrease in sexual offending on college campuses, by athlete populations, or anyone else. So we're overdue to do something different. Now, it is worth noting that there can be an artifact in that we do know that there is, because of increased awareness, and this is something I think advocates have done a wonderful job of doing, there has been more people that are willing to come forward, but it is exceedingly difficult for many different reasons. And so this just kind of shows that the problem is crescendoing, it's not increasing. Next slide. Dre Bowles was a wide receiver at Tennessee who had the poor judgment to take the victim of a sexual assault that was allegedly perpetrated by one of his teammates to the hospital. This led to several of his teammates assaulting him and his head coach telling him he was a traitor to the team. In Minnesota, where we had several members of the football team engage in sexual activity with a woman, even though there were no charges that were accepted by the prosecutor's office, there was still administrative review, and eventually it was the student body, it was a board of decision makers that were students that handed out the decisions to expel 4 of the players, 1-year suspension for 2 of them, and 4 of the other players were cleared. But the point is that this whole team was on board with this, as horrific as it sounds. So the idea that we're going to rely on people to stand up, it's a nice idea, I just can't count on it. Next slide. So this is what prevention really should look like. And I'm going to try to hit this quickly because I want to get to the risk assessment and the treatment parts of what's going on. We have to be able to provide statistics that explain what's going on, bystander interventions. We already talked about the legalities of consent. There's been improvement in this venue, but most people don't know about forcible compulsion, which is a component of many of the sexual assault statutes, which says that if someone complies because they're afraid of repercussion, that's a sexual assault, whether that threat is real or perceived. We need to have drugs and alcohol education, changing in the culture, sexual deviances. There's all kinds of things that are going on in the college hookup culture, but probably the most profound thing that doesn't get enough attention is toxic masculinity. And because I'm more interested in an accountability model rather than a bystander approach, I think someone has to be able to talk to these young men about what prison is like if that's where you wind up. In my estimation, right now, what's out there, you have the top two that are getting pretty good attention. Legalities, consent, and drugs and alcohol are improving, but they're not nearly as comprehensive as I'd like. Next slide. All right, so I just want to kind of hand off to Joe Ehrman, who's a former Indianapolis Colt and does a lot of great work on what being a real man is. And the issue is that we're not teaching boys how to become men. And they're taught that their manhood is dependent upon the size of their bank account, how fast they can run a 40, and how many women they sleep with. But it turns out it's the quality of their relationships and standing up for something and leaving a legacy that's really what matters. And we need to do more to focus on it. It's one of the reasons why more men have to come to the table in the prevention models. Next slide. All of these slides are going to be made available to you. Probably the most profound thing that I want to point out here in this slide is that unfortunately young men don't really understand what power and respect is, and very often they'll puff out their chest in order to try to improve their reputation. The sports culture that tells people to hide their emotions and get what they want does not help, so we need to make changes to that culture as well. Next slide. We're eventually going to get to a place that people are going to ask us to figure out who's going to do what before they're offered contracts and scholarships. It's bad for business. Next slide. So this is the model that I talked about before. Next slide. And when we talk about risk assessment, this is talking about getting a licensed psychologist who has both understanding of sports, athlete culture, forensic psychology, trauma, treatment of violence, etc. to the table. This is not hard to find, but we've been training on that at ASP for the last several years in continuing education workshops. Next slide. The themes that we find throughout when we talk about people that are at risk for this type of behavior: early behavioral problems, a lack of remorse, impulsivity, a lot of destabilizers. Gang involvement, drugs and alcohol, the willingness to continue to interact with people that are supportive of rape as a way to get their sexual needs met. Particularly, the hardest people to treat are those that engage in egosyntonic violence. Very simply, they do what they want because they want to, and they're going to continue to do so unless you change the environment. Next slide. Lastly, how you pull this all together is with treatment. But like I said at the beginning, you can't treat someone unless you assess them accurately in the first place. You have to know where it comes from. Keep in mind that a very high percentage of offenders have been victims themselves. So if you don't provide them any treatment, that either sex offender specific treatment for their trauma, anger management, prevention programs that are more comprehensive, then what's going to happen is you're going to increase the likelihood of recidivism. And if you don't treat the perpetrators, you're just going to get more victims, just maybe in a different place. I think that there's a lot of problems with young men understanding consent. There's been a lot of legal changes over the years, and they're long overdue because of how hard it is to get a prosecution for rape. The issues of disinhibition have to be considered. Athletes, unfortunately, from the time they're very young and they get a different set of rules, they start thinking they can have whatever they want, including sexual conquests. And we need to address toxic masculinity both on the group level as well as an individual treatment. Next slide. So to wrap up, if we're going to make an impact in everything, we can't be silent anymore. I think that the NCAA has actually been very slow to respond aggressively to this. I'm hoping that they'll build the momentum and bring people to the table who have understanding of how to treat perpetrators as well as victims, because if you don't do that, you're not going to get ahead of the problem. We also need to be mindful that there's reinforcers that are in place for schools, that if you have someone who's very athletically talented, you might be willing to take the risk of having them on your team in exchange for the wins that you get. We have to demand more comprehensive prevention than what's existed in the past. We have to take better care of the victims. And we not only have to get more sports psychologists to the table, we also have to train more sports psychologists on these issues, because it's not standard education in the sports psychology training programs. Next slide. R&R methodology should guide all risk assessments. Treatment has to be tailored to the specific needs of the perpetrators, and this has to be more than policy implementation. You know, in my estimation, we're trying to put a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. We're trying to catch up with a problem that's existed for a long time. It must be about doing what works with prevention and treatment, not just another version of what we've been doing for a long time. Next slide. And if there's more conversations that need to be had, I'm not hard to find. I look forward to talking about this more. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, speakers, for your excellent presentations and for bringing this important topic forward. Taken together, we might consider some of the presentations in light of life development intervention models, some of the work that Steve Danish has done, which basically note that you don't need to wait for a problem to occur before you take action, and that the absence of a current problem or a current legal issue is not evidence of a program that's on target or a life well lived, but rather there's more that can be done. So we talked about, or different speakers talked about, the need to be proactive. We also talked about enhancement, which is part of life development intervention models, where we're teaching skills related to living a purposeful life, as well as skills related to dealing with sexual issues on campus and in sport. And finally, we also talked about counseling and support for people who may have gone awry, or for a whole variety of reasons. So to act before, to enhance what's going on, and to act afterwards. What I'm going to do is start with one question for each presenter. There are also questions that some of you have posted, and I'll do my best to include those as well. And I'm going to kick off with a question for Connie. So Connie, thank you for presenting all that the NCAA has done, and particularly the activity in recent years, so we can really see a thoughtful process that's ongoing. You provided a strong background for the need and a call to action for all of us related to this topic. And I was wondering, for sports psychologists and perhaps also for coaches and students as well, what are some steps that you can see that these individuals perhaps who are listening to us today can take on their campuses with regard to sexual assault issues?
That's a good question. You know, I guess I would say, first of all, you know, sexual assault has been with us in our society forever. The recent emphasis in the past 10 years or so has been wonderful as far as I'm concerned. The emphasis, you know, has come from institutions, organizations, the media, the law, and it has resulted in more people coming forward. And the issue with people coming forward to report the crime, the policy violation, wherever you happen to be, of sexual assault, really requires us to have a better response. People will not come forward if they don't feel like they're being heard correctly. And so I would say, if people who are attendees today, if they could just not be investigators, but be listeners and appropriately believe and send the person for a good resource that will be able to help that person get the assistance that she or he may need, as well as get to the place where the perpetrator can be held accountable. I think we're all trying to work on that in one way or another. It's a matter of education education prevents, and response we just need to work on.
So thank you for that thoughtful answer. And I think one of the things that came across in your answer is that the NCAA is working in a collaborative manner and doesn't require or mandate particular responses, but that the responses are developed in collaboration with institutions.
Right. Yeah, and that's true. I mean, the hope is that there is going to be institutional accountability as well as individual accountability, and it's a process, you know, but it's beginning.
Thank you for that. I'm going to direct the next question, which sort of follows from what Connie set up for us, to John Heil. And John, you highlighted the importance of organizational responses to sexual assault and personal violence, and provided a really strong call to action. You also pointed out the double bind trap of lose-lose situations for organizations, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about both the call to action and the lose-lose trap.
I think the call to action is really for sports psychologists, as Mitch had pointed out. We're very silent in public discourse on a wide variety of issues, ranging from sexual assault to forms of interpersonal violence and other things as well. Then, as Connie also pointed out, sport's an excellent platform to call attention to issues and try to generate change. And perhaps, I think back to what Mitch said, if we don't do that, then we tend to make things worse. We flip the model around. So I think first and foremost, it's sports psychologists need to get involved. They need to be accountable, because we're the ones that are likely to hear these stories, often when no one else does, and we need to be prepared to go forward with that. And as far as the double bind, I'd like to think it speaks for itself. It's the trickiest of things to explain, but I thought Lang's concept was really, or his explanation of the concept was excellent. It's just a trap. And there's people that are skilled at creating these traps for people, and I think we just need to be willing to call them on it. And that was the reason I tried to expose it.
So thank you for that. One of the questions from an audience member was about what happens when those in power, like coaches, even athletic directors, are involved in these situations. So the Penn State scandal might be an example of that. Do you have any additional thoughts on that issue?
The more people that are involved, the more people there are defending things, the more influence their net of influence becomes broader and wider, and so the more involved, the more support potentially they have, and the worse the problem can be.
Thank you, John. I'm going to move to Mitch, and Mitch, you discussed, among other things, prevention of these problems, and that seems like something that Americans don't focus a whole lot on. You know, so we often respond very well after things happen, but it seemed like you really focused on prevention, but you also included a discussion of treatment and the value of treatment, and then also talked about maybe the possibility of assessing athletes before they arrive on campus and scholarships are awarded. So, you know, in some ways, all of those together are complicated, because you seem to speak for treatment being helpful and yet maybe not having problematic people on campus, and then I guess we might think about their rights being trampled on, as well as the rights of students to learn and practice in a safe environment. So I'm going to throw that complicated question at you, because it seems like that's a thing you can manage.
Oh, well, I think that the easy answer is that's why we're having this discussion with several experts at the table, and hopefully many people out there. This is not a problem that arrived overnight. Say exactly what Connie said. Didn't arrive overnight. It's not going to disappear overnight. I think that we have put a lot of efforts in prevention, which is kind of ironic, because you're right, Judy, America is not very preventive. We're not proactive. But we know that it's the right thing to do. We know that if we can try to get ahead of these problems, it can be helpful. And the irony of it is that risk assessment is actually part of prevention. If you have, and there have been institutions that have reached out to me saying, listen, we've had somebody who's been accused of something. We're not interested in waiting for the legal process to move forward. We need to know whether or not it's safe to keep this person on campus. Can you do a risk assessment? Yes, we can. You know, what people don't understand is that we assess risk in sexual violent people all the time. People don't understand that sex offending is actually a very low base rate crime. It doesn't happen as often as people think it does, because if it happens to you, it doesn't matter what the odds are. It's tremendously shaking. It has a surprisingly low recidivism rate compared to other violent crimes, but again, it's so damaging. And there are people that are repeat offenders. We know how to identify those folks. If we could do that, then it's going to be part of prevention, because you're preventing future victimization by that perpetrator. When the university or the system starts to realize, wow, we could actually do this, now we feel empowered. Then they'll amp up prevention more, then they'll put risk assessment in place more, then they'll get treatment for the providers. I mean, look, the treatment for the perpetrators is absolutely a prevention matter, sure. But we haven't even done a good job of making sure we get treatment for the victims. So we have a comprehensive problem, and I think that what sometimes happens is that people around a table, one person's holding a trunk, one person's holding a tail, and nobody wants to say this is an elephant that needs a lot of things to address it.
Okay, and related to that question, one of the listeners asked where or how to get additional training. So starting here is one place, but if they were interested in more, is there a particular central place that they could go?
I have done risk assessment training for sports psychologists as a continuing education workshop for sports psychologists and students at ASP almost every year for the last 5 to 10 years. I don't know anybody else who's doing training on it. I think that the prevention models that are out there, there's lots of different ways that they can get access to those and become proficient. But from my point of view, I don't know that there's a lot out there. And it's one of the reasons why I've tried to fill the void, because I think we need more sports psychologists at the table on these issues.
Thank you for that. And for people who aren't familiar with ASP, ASP is the Association for Applied Sports Psychology, which has an annual meeting, among other things. I'm going to open up a question to the group. And the question is about the role of social media in this topic. And there's sort of a second follow-up question regarding the, I guess I would say, the regular media, gender, and power. But let's start with the role of social media.
Well, I think we know that everything ends up on social media. Many things of which are just horrifying, and it seems like another more broad-scale opportunity for essentially boundary issues, as we would describe within psychology. What is the reasonable place to say and do and picture certain things? And so that's a problem. We do know that, for instance, hazing's been extensively studied. I think not all, certainly, but a high percentage of hazing incidents somehow end up being documented and posted on the internet. There was an incident with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, women's lacrosse team where they texted one another sort of veiled death threats from seniors to freshmen, and it's all public record. And people act as if somehow it's not there in a way. So it's really kind of the logic and the thinking behind the way things are posted is really just puzzling to me.
I think the anonymity gives people courage to do things that they normally would have good judgment to not. And I don't think that they appreciate the permanence. You know, this idea of Snapchat's only going to be on for a couple of seconds, as if there's no screenshots and things don't get disseminated all over the place very quickly. So, yeah, I mean, it's a vehicle that not only are you doing illegal and immoral things, you also have the poor judgment of sharing it with the world. And if you happen to have something someone sent you, congratulations, now you have evidence in a criminal investigation.
And I would just add that it shows how so many people do not understand the major impact that a sexual assault, that sexual violence is on the individual, that they feel entitled to post things for other people to see because they don't even think about it being as bad and as devastating as it truly is.
So there was a related question which I'm going to respond to, which is what are the ways that coaches of younger athletes can help to promote prevention before these young athletes reach the collegiate level? And I think that one of the ways we can address this issue is to talk about it. And there's a sort of view that if you talk about something, sexual behavior or drug use, that it will cause, or even depression, that it will cause people to do it. But we know pretty clearly from human behavior that even if no one talks about it, people figure it out. And that's why the human species continues to exist. And so being able to talk about what it means to be a member of this particular team in a safe and appropriate manner, and what some of the polls are, you know, as part of a team or part of a club or program. Those are all things that could be possible and help with prevention of who are we and what do we do right, and maybe address some of the issues Mitch touched on with regard to toxic masculinity. The next question is regarding the regular media and how the media intersects with all of this in terms of its reporting, both in terms of, I guess there's a whole lot of issues related to that, so I'm going to open it up to all three of you.
Sex sells. Sex sells, violence sells. There's a reason why America's Funniest Home Videos is one of the longest running series, because we like seeing people fall down. It would be nice if there was a moral compass that was superimposed over what the media was doing, but unfortunately they're in the business of selling news. And the tragedy of it is that there are times that allegations are being made, both with regards to a potential victim's identity, with regards to an athlete perpetrating, and the news. This is all being, you know, it's up on SportsCenter before anyone can corroborate anything. So, you know, I'd like to see more responsibility from the media. I've spoken to a lot of colleagues I know that are in the media about this, and they're stuck with the dilemma because they would like to sell the good stories, even though I'm not sure that they really are. But the thing is that they're getting their own pressures of making sure that the news cycle continues to spin. And when athletes transgress, you could argue that that's bigger news than wins and losses.
Mm-hmm.
I could add that from work I do with police departments, where I have intimate knowledge of events and I'm able to look at media accounts, and then also social media postings, that there's often a huge disconnect between what's really happening and what gets reported. And I'm afraid this is a sort of a broader issue, but I think there's some pre-written cultural narratives that belong to subsegments of society that define the story, that they become a template to fit stories in. I think that's the most offensive thing I think I see in the media, is they write the story too quickly, and they tell it within a set category rather than really understanding sometimes all the subtleties and the nuances of behavior.
And I think whether it's high school, college, or professional sports, athletes are known quantities. And so it's easy to find out information about them and to make it into a story. And what that really does is it neglects the fact that the average person involved in a sexual assault is not going to be a high-profile person. And so then it makes it harder, I think, for the communities to believe that it really is that extensive.
We have another sort of curveball on the topic of both the disbelief that our heroes or star athletes participated, and then also the rush to judgment means there are some false accusations that have been identified, and then that can also undermine the true accusations that actually happen. So it's certainly complicated. Because our time is nearing its end, I'd like to ask each of you for a take-home message. Please know that this is being recorded and that you have contact information for the speakers, because I did not get to everybody's question. And Connie, I wondered if you could kick us off with a take-home message or thought for today.
Wow. It feels like everything we've said is a take-home message, but I think just the fact that everybody needs to be involved in thinking about this topic, setting boundaries for themselves with regard to what they do, and understanding the effects of this kind of violence.
Thank you, Connie. John, how about you?
My message would be for sports psychologists, and it's simply, if not us, then who?
Thank you for that. And Mitch, how about you?
Yeah, I can't possibly be more succinct than John was. That was perfect. I think that we need to attack this problem comprehensively, get everyone to the table, and I think the other thing is that we need more men coming to the table. Too often, I think people assume that this is a woman's issue, ignoring for a second that there are very high incidence rates of male victimization as well. But just men aren't coming to the table enough. We need more men at the table for this issue.
So thank you all for your informative and wonderful comments, and I'm going to turn things back to Ryan to wrap it up for today.
Thank you all so much. A special thank you to Connie, John, and Mitch for sharing their expertise and having this conversation, and to our moderator Judy for facilitating the event. Again, the webinar was recorded. It will be available in the coming weeks. I'd like to encourage, just as a last note, anyone who's attending today to attend this year's APA convention in Washington, D.C. From August 3rd through 6th. Division 47 is offering a range of amazing programming, including a collaborative program with other divisions on sexual violence on college campuses. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.